They said, build a practice you love. I did. It died. Private practice didn't die in one big dramatic explosion. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a slow bleed, a death by 1,000 cuts. And if you've been in this field long enough, you can probably name every single one of them. I'm Dr. Colleen Long, psychologist, accidental CEO, and recovering perfectionist. I built a practice I loved. It died anyway. But here's the thing. Before I could understand why it failed, I had to perform an autopsy, not just on the business, but on myself, on the scared kid from small town Indiana who grew up with a scarcity mindset, on the overachiever who sold her body parts to pay for grad school, and on the clinician who confused exhaustion with ethics. It got worse. Today, I am doing a two-parter confessional. It's a series on the rise and fall of my own group practice. Two intentions here. One is just, I think it's going to be therapeutic, just to process what happened. Two, I think this will be incredibly helpful for many of the clinicians right now who are suffering in silence. We are not really allowed to talk about our own personal burnout or our struggles for fear of the licensing board coming after us and saying we need to take a break, right? We don't have stethoscopes that we can hang up at the end of the day. Our instrument is our heart, mind, and soul. If that is in some way compromised, we run risk of someone taking away our livelihood. I am now removed from all of that, and my livelihood does not hang on that piece of paper, which is my license that I work so hard for anymore. I feel more at liberty to talk about a lot of what happened to me candidly, and I hope that this reaches some people who were maybe in the position that I was last year and the years before and are just feeling really alone. And I want you to know that it is not you, it is a broken system. Okay, so I'm going to hop into this 2 or 3-parter series. It's called Autopsy of a Practice, and we are going to dissect how this thing that I built, bootstrapped from the ground up into 7 figures, collapsed, was rebuilt, and sold. Spoiler alert, this ends Rudy-esque, sort of. I eventually sold to someone who actually knew what they were doing from an operational side. The person had 20 years of operational experience, real capital, and actual infrastructure. All the things that I was white knuckling on my own for many years. But getting there, that was the hardest part because selling wasn't the win, it was the surrender I had to learn to call survival. Welcome to Off the Chair, where we are taking matters into our own hands in a system built to silence and enslave us. Ironically, in a world where everyone cries out the fundamental importance of mental health, now more than ever, there's no coincidence that if you treat the providers like workers in a Chinese sweatshop, everyone's mental health is only going to get worse. In today's two-parter, I share my story. It's a personal one, but one I'm sure will resonate with many. I'll also reflect on my part in the collapse and where I think I could grow from this. We as mental health professionals are experiencing what physicians experienced a decade before. And if you want a crystal ball, just look to that field. Over 60% of physicians were in private practice in 2012. That number has now dropped to under 40% in 2024. And I think probably less so than that. I think there's just not a lot of people that are reporting the various sort of private equity ownerships and things like that. I'm going to start this off with an origin story of just context to understand who I am, how I got here. I think for anyone who is in mental health and has clinical training, it will give you some context and maybe to some of the decisions that I made, right or wrong, just how it informs who I am and who I was as a leader and practice owner and clinician. After the origin story, if you're not interested in that, you can fast forward to the rise and the fall. We're going to do it from an autopsy perspective, death by 1,000 cuts. And we're going to talk about the systemic cuts that happen in our field and what so many of us are facing, but too really underwater to even talk about. Let's begin. I'm going to preface this with, I am still angry. I am really resentful. And I hate carrying that resentment. But as I am doing my own work on just trying to unpackage what happened in the last couple of years, we all know that anger is a secondary response to the primal emotion or primary emotion, which is fear. That fear for me, I think you'll start to understand where that comes from as I explain where I came from. I think I carry a lot of anger, resentment, guilt, because in some ways, this still feels like a failure where I'm at right now. And I know that all endings are just beginnings in disguise, but I haven't 100% figured out what that is, what that looks like. And so I'm in this weird intermediary phase where I don't know how I'm making sense of all of this. And maybe it's for this. Maybe it's to help other people who are struggling like I am. And I wished I would have had somebody out there talking about this then. So maybe that's the purpose of all of this. But right now, all of that training that I did, all of the work in grad school, you do 4 years in college, you do 3 years for your master, and then another 3 years for your doctoral degree. So 10 years, and then you're still not done because you have to get your hours and licensure. When you come out, you're in your 30s, you're 6 figures in debt, unless you were independently wealthy. You're still starting off, usually working under someone else. So by the time you actually hit your stride, you're in your 40s. All of that happened for me to now be in a really confident place that I will never work in a clinical capacity again. And that's a real mind fuck when you think about how much of my life was spent working towards this thing that I have just completely moved away from. So I want to start with that because as you hear the other podcast episodes and you hear me, I think there's probably some definite undertones of anger and resentment. And hopefully this will help give some light into where that comes from. I'm a good student. I've always been a good student. I was good at school, and I learned really quickly that being all A's, being an achiever was what got the attention, the gold stars. That's what got my parents' attention, approval. I thrived on approval. Firstborn kid. I think a lot of that was just sort of inherent in the fabric of my DNA. I grew up in a really small town in southern Indiana, close to Louisville, Kentucky. Most people did not go to college. Most people got married out of high school, had kids, and was just sort of kind of small town life, right? I knew I wanted something bigger than that, but I didn't know what that looked like. And at the time when you're coming up in the 80s and 90s, really it's like doctor or lawyer. Those are like your two sort of paths to success. I was good at school, and I knew that those two things were things that I could get if you're good at school. I did not like the law. I'm not a details person. And so I went doctor route. I grew up with a single mom, and my parents got divorced around the age of 7. It was really, I would say, probably looking back on it, we were sort of lower middle class. I remember going door to door and fundraising for cheerleading uniforms. There were other kids whose parents could just write a check, but you also had the option to fundraise, and that's what I did. One just poignant story that I hope this isn't like a poor me story. This is just to give you context. I remember I could not raise enough money for one of the uniforms. My coach benched me because I couldn't afford it. I didn't really think anything of it at the time, but then when my mom found out, she raised hell and was really upset. And looking back as a parent now, I understand why that would enrage parents. But just to give you context of like how scarce things were, it wasn't as though we were wondering where our next meal was coming from and we had a roof over our heads, but money was tight. When money's tight, when you grow up in families like that, money is talked about all the time. Everything is, do you know how expensive this is? There's fear. There's a lot of fear. The other poignant moment for me was watching my mom sit on the ground. My father had been leading sort of a double life. The woman he was having an affair with had called my mother and said that her house is in disarray and she would be calling CPS to have her children taken away. And I remember as a little kid, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, terrifying, absolute terror. I say all that because there's these key pivotal moments where I think that fear became the fuel for me to always make sure that I never got there again. And as I became a parent, that my kids would never get there again. Some of my really bad moves and bad decisions in the practice that you'll hear of come from is this sort of scarcity mentality that I grew up with. I'm not at risk of being homeless anytime soon. Even if we lost our house, we would find another one. We would be fine. There's many, many layers that would have to happen for our family to be homeless. Yet I wake up and my brain feels like that's the next step. That's really what I think sort of drove my drive for success, and always will, is just that sense of safety, need for safety. In a divorce, as you know, you're going between two homes. You have two Christmases. I just remember a lot of loneliness, a lot of fear, being alone for a lot of the time. I remember sitting and playing Lincoln Logs a lot, just feeling like there's got to be more to this. And I would see other families as I grew up and realize that there was something to the success of those families and their happiness. There was a correlation. It was perhaps the wrong inference to draw, but there's a million studies out there that show that there is a curvilinear relationship with money. And while money doesn't directly make you happy, there is a certain point at which you need to be able to pay your bills. I remember in that uncertainty, school saved me. I did well in school. I didn't really need a lot of help. I got a lot of accolades. I remember getting in these gifted programs, and we were making wontons, which I don't really know what that has anything to do about being gifted, but that's what I remember from the gifted programs. That's what saved me, was the academics. So later on, I got in the National Honor Society. I got a scholarship to college. As I was in college, I remember being in a stats class, really, really tunnel focusing in on it, and then people coming up to me and asking me to tutor them. This is sounding a little like self-congratulatory, but I promise you I'm getting there. I learned that the teacher was telling other students to come to me because I had the highest grade in the class. I felt really good. College was really the first look at like, whoa, there's a whole world out here of possibility. I was good at this gateway to that new world. I went full pre-med track and was just going to be a doctor. Thought that there's my ticket to freedom. Cut to taking the MCATs, going through the admissions process and all of that. I'm reading a book by a psychiatrist because I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in psychiatry or psychology. It was already starting to talk about how different the field is and essentially how you were being reduced to a pharmacist. There wasn't a lot of incentives to do therapy as a psychiatrist. There was no other real medical profession that I wanted to do because I didn't like blood. And so I pivoted last second to grad school. Got into grad school, fast forward. This is where I am. I'm in grad school. I'm head down, as we all do, getting the next thing, the master's, the doctoral, the license, the practice. Let me backstep here. So I'm on the pre-med track. Now, at this time, I am already starting to engage in some of these entrepreneurial stuff. No idea what I was doing. I created a company called Freud TV. It was like a PR agency for psychologists and other doctors who wanted to promote like their books or whatever and get on national media spotlights and things like that. Now, I had no business doing this. I had no idea how to create a business or even how I was going to market to get these people. I just had an idea. And unfortunately, given my personality, I just execute. So I spent lots and lots of money and mistakes on building websites, expensive websites, hiring people that were sort of predatory. I say all that just because as you get to know me and in these podcasts, I think the entrepreneur was always central to who I was. I have always had the ideas. It's just never really the grooming to see it through in the right way. I get into NYU, go to NYU, system shock for a girl from Indiana. That was my first bout of depression. As you're listening, you're like, wait, where are we going? I thought we were autopsy for practice. Now we're talking about depression. But I tell you this because I think a lot of these things that happen to us throughout life at the time were like, why is this happening to me? And later, there's so much meaning and perspective from some of those things that seem like a curse that actually become a gift. first bout with depression, first love, first boyfriend, all of that. The one that got away died suddenly. I was 19 years old and it rocked my world. I experienced depression for the first time. I didn't understand what it was. It was beyond sadness. It was clinical. It felt like there was this dark cloud everywhere I went. And I was scared. I couldn't eat. I couldn't swallow. I look back at pictures of myself at the time. I was really, really thin and just not doing well. I was not doing well. I say all that because at the time I would call my mom and say, I don't understand what's going on. Is this how adults feel? Is this how I'm going to feel for the rest of my life? And that was really, really scary. And she said, well, you're studying to be a psychologist. Maybe this is meant to help you have empathy and compassion for the people that you treat. And she was right. That was 100% where this began, was having that empathy and compassion for people who truly struggle with depression and helping validate for them. Depression is not just run-of-the-mill sadness. It is just this sort of never-ending storm cloud. And the first time you experience it and you don't know that time will heal and things will get better and it will ebb and flow, it can be really, really scary. Combine that with, I get into grad school, I am encountering, well, before I get into grad school, so let's take a step back. As I'm going through this depression, this is my first brush with this draconian sort of academic ideology, which is that there was really this sentiment in the late 90s and early 2000s of like, just if you can't do it, then you can't do it. You're just not cut out for it. Nowadays, no one would ever get away with that. Being depressed, for the first time in my life, I could not get out of bed. I couldn't make it to class. It was like I could not get out of my own way. I was watching myself fail, getting like C's, and had never done that before. I think from under the depths, I reached out to a professor there, and I remember talking about how I'm really, really struggling with depression. What could I do to make up the grade? And it was just sort of a blank stare, like, I mean, I don't know what you want me to say, like you've missed the last 2 classes and you didn't take your exam. Maybe this isn't for you. Eventually, I just got through it. Then again, that theme repeats itself when I'm in graduate school. And I don't know if this is the case now, but it was essentially an exploitation model of us working for free, providing a lot of mental health care in really, really poorly run community centers to get our hours. It was a grind. You're doing that on top of graduate school work. I remember this is now 5th year of grad school. I'm getting ready to graduate. It's my pre-doc. I'm working on my dissertation. I am in a skilled nursing facility. There is a supervisor there who I think thought he was a doctor, or at least wanted everybody else to be convinced that he was a real doctor. He wore a full physician's white coat, long jacket, everything, and would fly through the hospital and was just absolutely abusive. And again, would never get away with that in today's world. But at the time, it was really, really bad. I just got through it like I did with a lot of things in grad school. And I remember at the time we would go in and we would talk to these patients. They either had acquired brain injury or traumatic brain injury. So they're in this skilled nursing facility. I'm doing the MOCA or the mini mental status exam or Wisconsin card sort. So I'm constantly doing assessment. And I saw this patient who was in a net bed. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that world, it's like it almost looks like a cage that's over the patient in their bed, essentially so that they don't fall out again and re-injure themselves. I had no training on this whatsoever. I just was doing the work that I needed to do. My clinical intuition was this person is acting like an animal because they are being treated like an animal. So I'm going to unzip this net bed so that I humanize them and talk to them. And by the end of it, it was great. She was calm. She was like, I really like you. Are you coming back again? It was great. What I didn't know is I left that net bed unzipped, and it was a huge safety risk because she could have fallen out. I hadn't been given any sort of training or onboarding or any of that. And I think in today's day and age, they would have just sort of like slapped you on the wrist, written a PIP, and then been on with it. But this doctor, my supervisor, who was somewhat power hungry, contacted my entire grad school committee and said he was concerned about my ability to matriculate. And it was like a firing squad. And I had to meet with all of the professors from my graduate school along with him as they discussed whether or not I had what it takes to be a psychologist in my 5th year. I was now 6 figures in student loan debt, and all of it was getting ready to be thrown away. That was traumatic. I got some great advice from a attorney/psychologist who said, Colleen, I don't know why these graduate institutions are so draconian. They just are. My advice to you is do whatever they ask you to do, get that sheepskin, and just forget about it. And that's what I did. Why am I talking about all this? I'm talking about all this because it's such a grind to even get to where we are as clinicians, to get that master's degree, that doctoral degree. Then on top of that, to get the hours that you need and to pass the exams and to get certified with the boards. It's such a lift and so disproportionate to how we are valued and continually undervalued as a profession. And I'm sure that as I'm saying this, there's probably thousands of other people who could recount their own stories of this hazing that you go through to get into this field to help people, ironically. As I go through this origin story, you're going to see these other themes, which are just a little bit of a hustler. I am figuring out life as I go along. Again, parents did not have a college fund set aside for me, so I am just on borrowed dimes right now, right? I'm just racking up student loans. When I was in college, me and my boyfriend at the time had found a loophole in these online gambling casinos. Every time you had a new credit card, you were considered a new person. You got the online gambling, whatever it was like the bonus, right? So you deposit $1,000, you get 25%. And as long as you make that many in bets, you could pull out. So I never dipped into my own funds. I only played with the bonuses. There was 240 of these online offshore casinos. You do the math. I was writing $36,000 checks to NYU for my own tuition at that point. Did not need to have a job because I was making it on blackjack. Eventually we were banned because they got smart and started to hire systems that would detect when people were not losing money. That was over, but it was a good couple of years that we were able to just essentially, I was able to focus on school, not have to work at Steak and Shake. That was one just sort of fortuitous thing that I felt like was a God wink with the online gambling. I don't know. And then I discovered egg donation, and I saw that you could get paid to be an egg donor, especially if you had really good grades and things like that. They would pay more. At the time, I think there's more regulations on this now, but at the time you could just set whatever your rates were. And I would just say like 40,000. There were people that would pay it. I think they would pay it because it was the highest. And so sometimes people just want the thing that costs the most. All of this is these sort of like fortuitous moments that help me get to where I am. I don't really honestly know how I would have gotten through grad school without these things, because the lockdown inpatient unit I was working in as a postdoc in San Diego paid us $4.80 an hour to be able to even live. It's impossible. And I say all this because, gosh, the odds are stacked against you. You have to work so hard and have so much tenacity to get on the other side of this. And then look what waits for you on the other side. And I think that's where a lot of this resentment and anger comes from. I'm funding my education essentially with my body parts. I am selling my body parts to get through school and to be a clinician. At the time, I was also creating another venture called Peerceptions. The idea was to provide reviews on local businesses, things like that. And now it's Yelp. But to think that I could create something like Yelp on my own was just wild. And unfortunately, I have a wildly misplaced sense of self-confidence. That Mark Twain quote, "All you need is ignorance and confidence and success is sure." That's sort of my motto. Tried Peerceptions, got a little spotlight in the local newspaper. People were saying this is going to be the bathroom wall of the internet. And then shortly, I just moved on to the next shiny ball and didn't get into it. But again, you'll see this theme of just always thinking about what needs to be done. And okay, I'm the one to do it, but really no idea how to roll that out. Fast forward, I'm out of grad school. I have gotten all my hours, earned my stripes. I did my postdoc, indentured servitude, and I'm now licensed, right? I'm ready to kill, ready to go out there, hang up my shingle, and let's go. I am living in probably one of the highest cost areas of the country at this point. I'm living in Manhattan Beach, California. I'm just seeing a bunch of rich people that have rich people problems, but not, I mean, light years away from what I was dealing with only a year before in a lockdown mental health facility where I was seeing true schizophrenia, true bipolar, all of that. These people, I mean, I actually had one session where someone was like struggling with whether or not she should use her Capital One points for her vacation or not. And I was like, how have you gotten here? So I'm doing couples therapy and therapy with people who can afford it because at that point I didn't know how to even get on insurance panels and I was just charging like $250 an hour and people were gladly paying it. Recipe for burnout. You're seeing people back to back. I mean, at that point I was seeing 20 clients a week. You can't get anything else done, right? Because you're just in session and it takes its toll when you're constantly carrying everybody's file in your system for weeks and weeks and years at a time. I started to dread therapy. I think one, I'm just an introvert, so my battery runs thin after a while. At the end of the day, I was not feeling energized. I was like, oh my God, just 3 more days till the weekend. This is what I trained for. So like, what am I going to do? All right, this is it. I met a great guy. We got married. We had 3 kids. We realized we got to move somewhere else because it's not sustainable to live anywhere close to LA. We moved to Boston for a lower cost of living, which is not the case. Boston was not a lower cost of living. I took a step back, stay-at-home mom, just decided to raise my kids. I had twins at the time who were 2 years old, and I had an infant baby that was only 17 months behind them. I just thought, okay, well, my husband's going to take the wheel now and I'll be a stay-at-home mom. That lasted for about 3 minutes. I do not have whatever the fabric is to be the stay-at-home mom. I remember schlepping through the snow in Boston, New England weather, sub-zero temperatures with a triple stroller, my Honda minivan with salt crusted on the side, thinking, what am I doing? What is this life? This is not what I wanted. I slowly got back into private practice. When I was a postdoc, I sort of cut my teeth on bariatric evaluations. So pre-surgery, if someone's getting gastric sleeve bypass, that sort of thing, I would do all the pre-op evaluations, and I loved it. I loved the black and white of the assessment. I loved there's I'm going to see this person and then we're done. There's not like week to week. There's not like I have 30 clients that all have to decide to hire me again next week for me to be in business. I love just like having a really sort of like straightforward day. I started to do that again. And that's how the kindling started for this Boston practice that would soon become a 7-figure practice. I was still doing therapy at the time and remember thinking the days that I had therapy. I mean, first off, if you've ever lived in New England or experienced New England, it's just gray most of the time. It's just gray. I got seasonal affective depression really, really bad. I was using like sun lamps and trying to deal with all that. And I remember going into work, pulling up at a Dunkin' Donuts and being like, all right, let's just fuel up. Let's just get through today. And like in my head, I'm like, okay, so that's 100, that's 100, that's 100. So I'm going to see 6. That'll be 600 today. Like literally that's how I would make money and figure out like how I was going to, like we were going to live that week. I was exhausted. I was so burnt out. I remember like it was client 6 and this guy, it was always a mix of like therapy and evaluations. And this guy was going in for a spinal cord stem pre-op evaluation. And I had done so many of those that I could do them in my sleep. I got through his thing and then I would sit them in the lobby and they would fill out the self-assessment inventories while I was seeing another patient. And I got his forms and I remember him saying, wake up. He had picked up on the fact that I was just checked out. I was just kicking the can. So cut to, I'm still in Boston. I'm on 29 Com Ave. It's a really, sort of swanky area of town. I'm still seeing these sort of really smart executive type people, but still at the end of the day, I'm like, oh man, all right, I got 2 more days and then I'm done with this. And that was like how I was planning on going through the profession. I started to do more evaluations, and I noticed that the days that I was doing evaluations, I really enjoyed it. I was looking forward to it. I liked doing all of that and giving someone a tangible result at the end. CMS cuts rates for psychologists administering their own testing, which at first I was losing my mind thinking, well, there goes my business model. As you'll see, many themes here of me just thinking, oh my gosh, the world is imploding. And really, it was all in my favor, because what that did is it opened up psychologists to be able to use psychometrists or techs, much in the way that physicians now use PAs and NPs, and you could be in more places at once. So it allowed me to scale really quickly when I was able to start to use psychometrists for those codes to administer testing. I went full bore into the testing thing. I started to realize that I was not actually not gonna grow just doing this still. I'm still capped. There's a ceiling on the day. I started to hire more psychometrists, noticed that the revenue's increasing. Then I hired my first couple clinicians who were doing therapy for me and helping me with the intakes of these testing patients. Still, I'm on the phone with insurance companies calling about a prior auth that was denied or trying to get approved for a certain code or whatever. It was extremely frustrating. I started doing more of the admin work than the actual clinical work and thought, what am I actually doing? My husband, another ongoing theme in this, is the voice of reason that pops his head in the door one night and goes, hey, did you know that you made negative $10,000 last month? So as busy as I was, I had no clue of my business operations, what was going on, how to make sure that there was an ROI on what I was doing and who I was hiring. The first thing I needed to do, I realized, is to hire some sort of biller or practice manager. That was a stumbling block for me because, I mean, at the time, this was 10 years ago, they're starting off at $65,000 a year, and that was barely as much as I was making. So how could I reason hiring that? I read Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Work Week, and it was one of those moments because he was saying, look at your time, what it's worth. If your time's worth $150 an hour as a clinician and you're doing a $25 an hour job, you can outsource that so that you can get that time back to make that $150 an hour. With that, I hired my first person. Our revenue quadrupled. I mean, at one point, we were between 40 and 50% profit margin. As we got into this, one of the best decisions I ever made was to hire someone that was a practice manager and a biller. And it wasn't lightning in a bottle of first hire. There was plenty of hires that were not the right fit, but the one that I found built this rickety sailboat with me from the ground up. The problem is that she was the only one that knew how to steer the ship and had all the keys to the kingdom. And I had no idea anymore how to steer the ship or how much was involved in steering the ship behind the scenes. So what I mean by that is she had built these systems from the ground up in terms of understanding which payers required prior auth, which payers required certain codes, wait times, just certain procedures, how to log into different portals, all of that. Really was top notch in terms of talking to patients and doing the practice management aspects, but then also billing was really, I think, the driving force to taking me from a very small practice that was barely profitable to a practice that was then being sort of courted by all of these private equity firms and things like that because of the profitability of the model. Also, we were one of the few practices in Massachusetts that accepted pretty much every single payer by that point. And we did neuropsych testing. So it was a niche. The demand was high. So we would have probably 400 inquiries a month and we had no marketing whatsoever. Business was booming. The only hitch in that point for me was that I was miserable in Boston. I had no friends, no social life. I was a stay-at-home mom at this point that was also doing a private practice that was burning her out. Every day was gray and cold and dreary. I felt like I was dying. I was California dreaming for sure. And my husband would just sort of say, yeah, well, we'll look into it. We'll look into it. Well, 3 years later, I finally said, hey, I found this QME position. It's a qualified medical evaluator. And I'll just fly out to California and I'll do that. And then I'll fly back. And in my mind, I thought, best of both worlds. I don't have to uproot my family. I can get my California fix. Great. And he said, we'll move back. One of the happiest moments of my life was moving back to California. Despite all the craziness of politics here and the taxes, man, it's a slice of paradise. I say that because I think sometimes when you hear my story, you might say, well, move to a different part of the country that doesn't cost so much. But being here really makes my life better. The sun, being outdoors, the people are all transplants. So you have instant friends. People are used to making friends quickly, and the innovation and having Tahoe and Vegas and all these places that are really close to us is just, I love it. And so I do choose to live in one of the highest cost areas of the country, Orange County, California. There's no doubt in my mind that this is where I'm supposed to be. So cut to 2019, we moved to California, and I am at that point thinking I'm going to have to close down the Boston practice. My practice manager and biller, I let her know, and she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, let's see if we can keep this going, because at that point we had a bunch of clinicians and we had other people, so I didn't necessarily have to be there, and I could run it from afar. 2021, whenever the pandemic hit, it just was like cooking with gas. Now all of a sudden everything went online. It was a perfect fit, and I was able to keep the practice going. Also add to that more people than ever were experiencing mental health issues because of the pandemic. Families needed their kids assessed. They needed diagnosis to get their kids in school versus remote learning. Our practice it hit an all-time high. Massachusetts had a huge, or still has a huge, opioid epidemic. A lot of the doctors were being cracked down on, and so referring to us as a first line of assessment was really a sort of cover your ass move, but good for business for us because we had to do all of these assessments then for sort of the prescribing doctor's insurance policy. All of that to say that demand was not an issue at this point. It really felt like a cash grab, supermarket sweep, trying to get all of the patients that needed us at that time because we just really didn't know what was happening with the world. And I think this was the beginning of burnout for me because it just didn't stop. So we had a wait list stretching months. I mean, a 4-month wait list for testing. At the time, then TikTok was sort of coming up and creating this generation of armchair diagnosticians. There were people on there that were, if you like big spoons, you have autism. If you like velvet, you have autism. We had a resurgence of people that were wanting autism testing and really attached to that autism diagnosis. I did see myself as a gatekeeper because I have a son who's on the spectrum. I also know a lot of kids who are on the spectrum, and I felt a sense to protect the kids that truly had autism, because if we dilute the pool and everyone's neurodivergent, then who's not neurodivergent, right? I mean, people that just honestly were experiencing social anxiety and they didn't get the normal socialization that you get during those crucial developmental periods because of the pandemic. It became harder and harder to interact with other people, but that didn't mean that all of a sudden you develop autism at 17 years old. And yes, I know that we have more of a understanding of what autism is, and so we're having a higher incidence of diagnosis, but not at the rate that it is right now. I just had no patience for this trend that I had saw 5 years prior with ADHD, where everybody was demanding that they had ADHD, and a lot were med seeking. That's what I loved about the testing, is that we have objective diagnosis. We have DSM criteria to say, like, you don't meet this. And unfortunately, people that come in with this preconceived notion of what they have based off of, whatever expert they're listening to on TikTok, get really upset if you don't give them the diagnosis that they want. Being in this field alone also carries with it some of the drawbacks of you're not developing a therapeutic relationship with a client like you are in therapy. Being in an evaluator position can often make you the bad guy. This is the rise of the practice. This was the Roman Empire, the Renaissance. It was just this beautiful synergistic thing. There was this stretch between 2020 and 2023 where I felt unstoppable. I was like, oh, I've hit my stride. This is great. I figured out how to do it. Maybe I am going to be successful. I had gone from a clinician making, $52 an hour from UBH to a CEO that was making over 540K in 1 year, I remember, and thinking, I never thought that this was possible. I had employees, I had a biller, I had an HR team, a practice manager. We had a wait list. I was like, okay, I've hit my stride. This is what I was built for. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this thing that I had created from nothing. So I doubled down. I was listening to these podcasts about scaling. I was reading Traction, EOS, any book I could get my hands on, really. I was joining masterminds. I remember 1 year I spent over $50,000 in my education of just masterminds, Vistage, Entrepreneurs Organization, EOS, Cameron Herold's Second in Command, Invest in Your Leaders. I had a business mentor / coach who was not cheap. And I was like trying to get the equivalent of an MBA essentially in 3 months. I was reading The Rockefeller Habits, Scaling for Success, all of these things about what needed to happen and starting to realize, ooh, we are so far from being where we need to be. First off, we had no SOP. I didn't even know what an SOP was, a standard operating procedure. So every time someone new came into the company, we would have to retrain them again on what the thing was. And it was like a game of telephone. We had no KPIs, so nobody knew what defined success for their role. No cost containment. I had no idea how to even run a P&L. For many years, I was just winging it. As long as there was money in the bank at the end of the day, I was like, great, we're doing good, we're flush. I really didn't understand my numbers, and I really didn't understand how much we were making per case, what a clinician was worth, what a psychometrist was worth, what retention was worth, and what turnover cost us. These were all things that you don't know what you don't know until you start learning about it, and then you feel like, I have so much further to go. Like anything, I just fully powered into learning how to be a CEO, learning how operations run and how great businesses scale. I had at that point 2 people who were sort of my wing women in this practice. So the one who had built it with me from the ground up in Boston, and then one that had started as my sort of personal assistant out here, but worked her way up, and they were like thick as thieves. I'm not going to use their real names, but I will call them for the purposes of, if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out. One was Joy in my phone and was very much like, it's fine, we're all fine. And then the other one was Disgust and just annoyed at every single thing. And you'll see that takes its toll on you. And I remember my mentor saying that somebody who's emotionally toxic, that is a key stakeholder in your organization, you'll earn every penny of that person. And I did. We had employees defect. We had a big turnover problem because this person essentially, she was really, really good at what she did, and she expected the same standards from everybody and had really very little patience. And sort of the masshole mentality, which if you've been to Massachusetts or you know anybody from Massachusetts, there's a little bit of a masshole attitude.